Hi, this is Herb Chase, and this is a short PowerPoint presentation on how to give a great PowerPoint presentation. And with any luck, this will be one of them, but I'll let you be the judge. Over the past several years, I've been reading the PowerPoint presentations of students on psych or primary care who voluntarily elected to send their PowerPoints to me and get some feedback. I've noticed a couple issues that I thought I would address in this PowerPoint and that it might be helpful to you for those who don't want to submit your PowerPoints to me for sort of individual coaching. The learning objectives are pretty straightforward. At the end of this podcast, you should be able to explain the rule of three, sounds mysterious, less is more, classic, who said what, do I believe what I've read, that's always an issue that we grapple with, who's the expert, and how do I get to Carnegie Hall. That's how we'll finish. So let's start with the rule of three. Basically, it's well known in the teaching circles that it takes three passes to get across the main points. First, you tell them what you're going to tell them, then you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. How do we do this in a PowerPoint presentation? Well, we tell people, the audience, what we're going to tell them by presenting the learning objectives. First slide should always be the learning objectives, where you list 3 or 4 key learning objectives. These are really the take-homes that you want your audience to get. Then there's the presentation. So you explore each objective in greater but not excessive depth. And then you add with the conclusion slide. You tell them what you've told them. It's a little bit different. It's a little more nuanced. And it is usually just a short list of important conclusions which reinforces the main points. Less is more. Classic, overly wordy slides. Audience will read the text and not listen to you. In fact, right now you're probably reading the text and not listening to me. It also shows that you haven't really focused on the main points. They're just too many words which you needed to condense and summarize. And at its worst, overly wordy slides are boring. So my rule of thumb is at most 60 to 70 words on a slide. Any text displayed must be discussed. Otherwise, why show it? I'm sure you've sat through PowerPoints where there's all this text on the slide the presenter never really discusses. If you don't discuss something, don't put it on a slide. Use edited declarative bullets. Bullets are really actually one of the best parts of PowerPoint and can help you summarize the main points. Here's an example of a very dense paragraph. It's about Merck rigging data for Vioxx. It's actually pretty interesting, but what am I going to do here? Am I going to read this whole thing in front of you and then you're going to be trying to read it while I'm reading it to you? And basically, at the end of the day, it's not going to be very effective. So, and this is 90 words, so there's way too many words on this slide. Convert it to simple bullets, and this, I think, gets the point across. It's 61 words. Merck overruled its own scientists, ... The Merck scientists repeatedly urged the researcher to change his views, ... and then a report to the FDA. So once again, if you have something complicated with a lot of words, divide it up into bullets and then just be parsimonious about what you put in those bullets. Animation is always tricky, but it's often a good idea. It slows you down. I like animation, as you've noticed from this talk, especially when I'm talking to an audience. We have the animated bullets here, and you just work your way down the slide. Now, what about tables? Many of the students, faculty, we all do it, put in directly from the journal article a table such as this. I think this might have been the New England Journal of Medicine. On one hand, it seems like the ethical thing to do. You have a whole bunch of data from a study you want to show the audience. To some extent, you're saying to the audience, look, I'm not really going to make any conclusions about this. You look at the numbers and you decide. I mean, the fact of the matter is there's a long list of problems. This is, I think, COVID problems. And then there are all these hazard ratios with confidence intervals. You're never going to speak about those confidence intervals. So what do you do with this? There's good data here. There are a lot of interesting things. You're going to make bullets out of it. And so here are some very simple bullets. Here's the original table over here, just so you can see how many words it had. Here are some major risk factors. Again, you make some judgment calls, and factors that are not associated. Again, you're the boss. You decide what is the most important data. You don't have to discuss it all. If somebody raises their hand and asks about, high blood pressure or some other issue, you can certainly answer that. Figures are also a problem. Here's a figure on the left. This was in a journal article that I saw. It's got a square here that's 10 by 10, which is 100 individual boxes. And there's no way that A, you're going to discuss that, and B, anybody looking at it is going to make any sense of it. Now, I must admit that if a whole bunch of these boxes were red and a whole bunch of these boxes were green, there might be a way to use the slide to show a major difference between two experiments, perhaps, or two results. But that's often not the case. This, on the other hand, is a perfect slide figure. Quite coincidentally, this is a figure of audience attention span. This is time. Within 5 minutes, the attention span usually plummets. I hope you're listening at this point because I have a couple more things to say. One of the things I do sometimes is redraw the figure. Again, I have the citation on the slide, a full disclosure, but I simplify the slide if I think it's really important. Let me answer one of the learning objectives. Who said what? Medicine is evidence-based. You must, I know all of you are pretty good about this, you must put your citations on the slide on which the information was presented. I know that many of you have bibliographies, which is fine, but when a slide has particular data, you need to put the citation on that slide, really for two reasons. One is to pay homage to acknowledge the work of the investigators. The other is it's not inconceivable that somebody in the audience is going to take out a pencil and paper and jot down the reference because they want to look up the reference that you just cited. So put it on the slide. This is an example of that. Here's a study of prompting providers to give patients HPV vaccine. It clearly works. And here's the title of the article, and here's the citation. And all of us, when we're giving our presentations to whatever group, always put the citation on the slide. A much more difficult question to answer is, do I believe what I've read? So let me give you a 5-minute or less talk on the natural history of medical information. Initially, there are a bunch of hypotheses. I think this drug is going to make people better. I think that this test is going to have a high sensitivity and specificity. There's an initial hypothesis, and there's a single study which is published, obviously, in PubMed. But there's no assurance that the results are correct. In fact, there are many studies showing that most of the results of single studies end up being incorrect or uncorroborated. Then, after many single studies have been performed, systematic reviews are undertaken, and many studies are looked at by the reviewers to decide whether or not there's enough evidence to support the idea. Many of the systematic reviews in Cochrane or Dynamed actually conclude that there's not enough evidence, that none of the studies had controls, that there's not enough evidence to support or refute the initial hypothesis. But if the information passes muster, it gets past the systematic review, then it's probably good to go as dogma into a textbook. So keep this in mind. The single studies are perilous at times because they are not corroborated in the future. And textbooks may not have exactly cutting-edge information, but it has information that you can believe in. So how do we visualize this? Some of you may have heard this talk before, or you heard other podcasts from other people. We call it the evidence pyramid. At the very top, there's the fewest sources, but they are gold standards. And the most reliable evidence would be computerized decision support. You're not going to put something into a support tool that is not absolutely considered the gold standard. But below that, and actually we don't have that many decision support systems, we have summaries, which are textbooks. So our textbooks, we have many from that are available in the library. They really have the state-of-the-art understanding of what the issues are. Below that, somewhere in the middle, are the Cochrane systematic reviews. And these are looking at hypotheses and the studies that undertake to prove or disprove them, but have not yet concluded that it's worthy of textbook status. In the textbook, you'll see that often Cochrane reviews are referred to, as are the basic studies in PubMed. The original articles are all down at the bottom, and they're the least reliable. I've already mentioned why corroboration is often lacking, and it makes it difficult when you're searching to start off in PubMed and the studies, because you don't really know if the study ended up being worthwhile. So what's your strategy? For your talks, start with the textbooks. And obviously, whatever discussion you're going to have with your audience in psychiatry or primary care, you're going to want to start off at a high level. Access Medicine, which I hope most of you are aware of now, and the library's website has every textbook that you can imagine, Harrison's and dermatology and surgery, etc. So if you look, you're going to give a talk on bipolar disease, start with the textbook, and then you might then be exploring whether or not, for example, there's a new therapy for bipolar disease. So you could look for a systematic review, and there might be a review on 2 or 3 new medications and what the reviewers thought was the likelihood that these medications actually of any value. And if there are no Cochrane reviews, that's one of the challenges of Cochrane reviews, is they don't study everything. You may then go to PubMed. We are, after all, a tertiary institution. We're treating people who have not been easily treated elsewhere. We may use cutting-edge therapy that's not completely corroborated. You go to PubMed yourself, and then you find the articles that might speak to the benefit of a new therapy or not. But you'll have to exercise a fair amount of critical thinking in order to come up with a conclusion. So again, I would start in textbooks, go to the reviews, and then hit PubMed for state-of-the-art questions. One way to discern whether or not what you're reading is of value, it's going to sound perhaps a little paranoid, but I think it's been proved by like 30 years of research, is conflicts of interest. Doctors and scientists write articles about therapy and new drugs, and they often are conflicted, that they have industry sponsorship. It has been well demonstrated in the literature that industry-supported research overstates the benefits and understates the risks. And I think it's really up to you, now when you're in PubMed and you're looking at those original articles, that you exercise some critical thinking, that you look and find the conflicts of interest. So here's a study on using the chronic vagus nerve stimulation to improve the quality of life in resistant major depression. It's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis. So the company made a gizmo that stimulates the vagus nerve. These people did a study, and the results, frankly, were pretty mediocre, and leading me to suspect that, I'm not sure whether or not these scientists were acting independently. And here are their affiliations. It looks pretty impressive. Washington U, Department of Psychiatry, Washington U. But then you start seeing a Duke, there's an outstanding institution, Texas Tech. But if you look closely, you see that the company that makes the gizmo has also supported all these 7 people. There's a list of the conflicts, and you'll see that this company has basically either given money to or supported in some other way all these people, all these scientists on the list. So my rule of thumb, it's simple. I don't think it's being paranoid. It's basically if a study is heavily industry sponsored, I will consider the benefits overstated and the risks understated. This doesn't mean that the study is not without merit. I just want to make that clear. It does not mean that the study is not without merit. It has to be corroborated. Certainly the statin companies heavily invested in statin studies. We know that statins are a lifesaver, literally, just because Merck gave money for statin research doesn't mean that statins don't work. So you have to make the decision on the paper that you're reading and decide whether or not you can believe the results. This was not impressive. I want to end with a couple slides. Who's the expert during this talk? You are. When you walk into that room and you've got this PowerPoint, you will know more about this topic than anyone else in the room. No matter how insecure you might be. It's a new clerkship, and what do you know? And you've only just started 2 weeks ago. You're all very smart students, but I'm convinced, especially from reading the PowerPoints that I've seen, that you will literally become an expert in the topic that you've chosen. And this means, as the expert in the room, you should be encouraged to give your own opinion. I think one of the mistakes that the students make, I know full well that they really have mastered the literature. They're a little bit loath to give their opinion about what they've found. So I think you're encouraged to give your opinion during a conclusion because you really are the expert. And lastly, I will end with a quote that has been in the papers over the years. You New Yorkers have probably heard this. How do I get to Carnegie Hall? It's a classic question. How do I get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. Which means practice your talk. Give it out loud. There's something magical about giving a talk out loud that focuses you on what the tongue twisters are, what is going to work, where the segues are awkward. Wow, this was much easier to explain than I thought, or wow, this was much harder to explain what I thought. You really need to give the talk out loud. It helps you reorder things too. Like say, wow, that actually would be better in the beginning, or maybe I should expand that part and get rid of that. And in so doing, you're actually in a position of memorizing. It's like a script, what you're going to say. So your slide transitions are effortless. I'm also a fan of don't think on your feet if possible. You don't want to be thinking about how to say something in the middle of your talk. Certainly, if somebody raises their hand and asks you a question, you'll need to think on your feet. I'm convinced you'll know the answer to it, or say, I don't know the answer to it based on all your research. But it's nice to have a little script. It makes the whole thing sound effortless, and it is much more pleasing to the audience. And you'll be able to proceed smoothly without standing there and thinking about what you're going to say next. Anticipate what aspects of the talk are most difficult to explain, and then work on those points. Rather than practice over and over the same part of the entire talk. I'm sure those of you who play a musical instrument, have been in drama, you know that there's certain areas that are tough. You go work on those. In conclusion, see, I'm now going to give the conclusion slide, which is the third leg of the tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them. The conclusions are: start with learning objectives and end with a conclusion slide. Keep words to an absolute minimum. And if you're going to discuss something, of course, put it on the slide. If you're not going to discuss something, then don't put it on the slide. It's not just there to show people how much you've learned. They'll get distracted as well. Summarize data and try not to show complicated tables and figures. And as I mentioned, you cite the sources, be critical of the information report, put the citations on the slide. And lastly, just to reinforce, I practiced this talk. You may not have realized that. Practice your talk out loud to work out the kinks, edit, and rearrange. Thank you, and I hope this was helpful.